In the 1600s, nearly 500,000 people were packed into a city where a single bridge carried not just traffic, but entire lives above a dangerous river. London was one of the largest and most vibrant cities in Europe, shaped by trade, heavy river traffic, and constant movement along the Thames. It had become a crowded, rapidly expanding metropolis. In this video, we'll bring historical paintings and engravings to life using modern AI tools. This allows us to freely change perspectives, capture different camera angles, and bring movements to life within the same scenes, movements the original artists could never have imagined. Our first stop today will be that iconic structure we know as Old London Bridge. In the 1600s, Old London Bridge was far more than just an ordinary river crossing. Viewed from a distance, it appeared to hang over the Thames like a densely built street. This bridge connected London to Southwark. Houses, shops, warehouses, small chapels and gates covered the bridge so completely that it looked like a continuous neighborhood floating on the water. The bridge consisted of narrow stone arches resting on massive piers. These arches narrowed the Thames's tidal current, creating powerful water currents that made river traffic quite dangerous. To understand what Old London Bridge truly was, you first need to forget every modern idea of what a bridge should be. A bridge today is a passage, a means to an end. You cross it, you forget it. Old London Bridge was something else entirely. It was a destination. Records from the Bridge House archives, among the most detailed urban records to survive from early modern England, show that by the 1600s, the bridge was home to more than 500 people. Haberdashers, drapers, stationers, grocers, apothecaries. Families who had lived here for 2 and 3 generations. Children who had never known any home that did not tremble slightly when the tide turned beneath the floorboards. Boats trying to pass between the arches struggled against strong currents, and accidents were frequent. The buildings on the bridge could reach several stories high, often jutting out over the road. People lived directly above the constant din created below by wagon wheels, horseshoes, and pedestrians. Fire was a constant threat. The crowds were incredible, yet people continued to live and work here for generations. Crossing the Old London Bridge was not merely walking along a trade route. It also meant passing beneath the tangible symbols of authority and control. Beneath the bridge, the Thames was London's main transportation artery. Barges, ferries, merchant ships, and small boats loaded with grain, timber, coal, cloth, and imported goods seemed to fill the river. The river connected London to the English heartland, to Europe, and to the wider Atlantic world. It transformed the bridge into a critical juncture where local life met global trade. The records of the Bridge House note that in 1633, fire swept through the northern section of the bridge, destroying a stretch of houses that was never fully rebuilt. That gap, that accidental fire break, would save an entire district of London 33 years later, when the Great Fire of 1666 came roaring toward the Thames and found nothing left to burn on the northern end of the bridge. History is sometimes saved not by design, but by disaster arriving slightly too early. During severe winters, the narrowing current beneath the bridge's arches could set the stage for the river to freeze over. On these rare occasions, the Thames would freeze over briefly, and people would gather and walk on the ice beneath the bridge. This scene stood in striking contrast to the river's usual dangers. This image shows the bridge's northern entrance, viewed from an angle approaching just beside St. Magnus, the martyr church on the left. By the mid-18th century, the bridge had fallen into such disrepair that officials decided to clear it and rebuild it. Between 1756 and 1762, the buildings that had filled the bridge for centuries were gradually demolished. Although the painting appears to date from the 1700s, it actually depicts this crucial crossing point that shaped London's destiny for centuries. Perhaps its most striking feature is that it remains a place that can still be visited today. The Thames Frost Fairs were not simply a curiosity. They were a complete inversion of the city's normal logic. A river that in summer demanded skill, nerve, and a strong back to navigate, that swallowed boats and drowned watermen, became, in the depths of winter, a public square. Vendors set up stalls. Ox roasts were held on the ice. Printers dragged their presses onto the frozen surface and produced souvenir pamphlets stamped with the date and the words, "Printed on the Thames." For a few weeks, the most dangerous stretch of water in London became its most festive address. And then the ice cracked, the river returned, and London went back to work. What made Old London Bridge extraordinary was not merely its engineering feat, it was also the fact that it functioned as a living space. The bridge served simultaneously as infrastructure, a marketplace, a neighborhood, and a symbol. Kings and ordinary citizens passed through here. Merchants and laborers worked here, and those visiting London for the first time got to know the city through this narrow passage. The Old London Bridge was crowded, dark, and often unsanitary. It slowed traffic, restricted trade, and posed a constant danger to those living there. Yet it remained an indispensable fixture for centuries. Until the 18th century, it was the only permanent crossing over the Thames in central London. Consequently, north-south movement was inevitably tied to this bridge. For many of us, the chance to experience this historically strategic bridge, even for just a day in its former state, would be incredible. For now, this AI reconstruction seems to be the closest we can get to that dream. This is Buckingham House, dating from the late 17th to the early 18th century. Before it became Buckingham Palace, it was a private residence on the western edge of the city, set apart from the crowded centre and surrounded by open spaces and gardens. At that time, it symbolized the boundary between London's urban fabric and the countryside. It served as a reminder that, no matter how densely the city grew, its boundaries could still be felt. It is worth pausing here to consider what London's western edge meant in the 1600s. The city's energy flowed eastward, toward the river, toward the docks, toward the trade that made London one of the wealthiest places on earth. The West was quieter, cleaner, and considerably more exclusive. Buckingham House sat at the threshold between the city's commercial fury and the open countryside beyond. To own a house here was to signal that you had risen above the noise, that London worked for you rather than the other way around. Within a century, the Crown itself would agree. In September 1666, London faced one of the most devastating fires in its history. What began as a small fire spread rapidly through the city, with its predominantly wooden structures, narrow streets, and cramped layout, and turned into an uncontrollable catastrophe. In the first image, Ludgate is engulfed in flames, and in the distance, the square tower of the old St. Paul's Cathedral appears to be in danger. Shortly thereafter, that massive structure would also be destroyed. The second image looks across the Thames from the area around Tower Wharf on the evening of September 4th. London has effectively turned into an unbroken wall of fire. On the left, London Bridge. On the right, the Tower of London, both largely spared, while Old St. Paul's burns right in the centre. Within just a few days, much of medieval London had been reduced to ashes. Yet this fire was also a turning point. It swept away centuries of cramped, accumulated structures and forced the city to rebuild and reshape itself from the ground up. What the Great Fire of 1666 destroyed was not merely buildings. It destroyed a version of London that had accumulated over 4 centuries. A city of narrow medieval lanes, overhanging timber frames, and neighborhoods so dense that sunlight rarely reached the ground. The fire burned for 4 days. When it was over, more than 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and the medieval Cathedral of St. Paul's were gone. The rebuilding that followed was faster than almost anyone expected. Within a decade, a new London was rising. Wider streets, brick construction, Christopher Wren's churches lifting their white spires above the ash. It was a more rational city, a more legible city, and by almost every measure, a less human one. The old London, dark, cramped, dangerous, vivid, was gone, and nothing that replaced it ever quite captured what had been lost. The Tower of London, rising above the Thames, was the heart of royal power in the 1600s. At that time, it served as a fortress, an armory, a treasury, and one of the country's most notorious prisons. Prominent figures accused of treason were imprisoned here. By housing the royal archives, weapons, and crown jewels, the tower demonstrated that it was not merely a prison, but one of the cornerstones of the state. The tower's role in the 1600s went beyond imprisonment. It was a place of deliberate psychological weight. Arriving in London by river, as most important visitors did, you could not miss it. The white stone walls rose directly from the north bank of the Thames, massive and unhurried, projecting exactly the kind of permanence that royal power wanted to project. Prisoners brought to the tower arrived through the river gate, a low arch in the outer wall that would eventually become known as Traitor's Gate. To pass through it was to understand, with great clarity, that the normal rules of your life had been suspended. The tower did not need to announce itself. It simply stood there and let the river carry the message. This scene depicts Cheapside in 1638. It was one of London's most important streets during the arrival ceremony of Queen Henrietta Maria, daughter of Queen Marie de' Medici of France and King Charles I. Cheapside was not merely a commercial street, it was also a magnificent stage for royal ceremonies. It was adorned with water arches, crosses, and temporary decorations. At its centre stood the famous Cheapside Cross, a well-known symbol and meeting point. As soldiers, officials, and the public gathered beneath this splendour, these moments also reflected the rising political and religious tensions. Henrietta Maria's Catholic faith and foreign origins had already sparked significant unrest in a city already on the brink of civil war. Today, this street still stands as modern Cheapside near St. Mary-le-Bow in the City of London. Though the medieval structures have vanished, the street lives on. This image, taken in 1647 during a period of deep division in England, shows the political and religious complex in Westminster as viewed from the opposite bank of the Thames. On the left stands the old Palace of Westminster, the seat of Parliament. In the mid-17th century, particularly during the Civil War, it was at the very centre of the conflict between the monarchy and Parliament. Adjacent to it rises Westminster Hall, one of the palace's oldest and most magnificent sections. Courts, important state trials, and major assemblies were held here. Its massive roof served as a symbol of royal authority for many years. On the right stands Westminster Abbey, the spiritual heart of the nation. For centuries it has hosted coronations, royal funerals, and the burials of monarchs. In 1647, the Abbey found itself caught between tradition and change. Religious divisions were fundamentally reshaping England's institutions. At the centre of the scene are the Westminster Steps. They were a river landing frequently used by those arriving and departing by boat. Before bridges and roads became widespread, the Thames was London's main transportation artery. It carried politicians, clergy, journalists, and the public directly to the seat of power. This engraving depicts Whitehall Palace in 1643. At that time, it was England's largest royal residence and the monarch's primary place of residence. Kings and court officials would arrive by boat via these steps overlooking the river. This underscored the central role the Thames played in both transportation and power. Whitehall was not a single building. It was a vast complex comprising staterooms, chambers, and administrative structures. A fire in the late 17th century destroyed most of it. Today, only the banqueting house remains. This building is the last surviving part of the complex that was once the heart of royal life. This, however, was Richmond Palace in the 16th and early 17th centuries. It was one of the most important royal residences located outside central London. Rebuilt by Henry VIII on the site of an old manor house, the palace had become a frequent retreat for monarchs during the Tudor and early Stuart periods. It offered cleaner air and extensive gardens. Queen Elizabeth I spent her final days here and passed away in 1603. Thus, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. Over time, the palace was abandoned and gradually fell into ruin. Today, as part of modern Richmond, only some wall remnants and traces of the original layout remain. Looking at these moments, it's truly hard not to feel how close the past actually is. These streets, these buildings, and these events shaped the world we live in today. Nothing that happened back then was in vain. We often imagine history as the story of grand structures and powerful figures. But perhaps history is the story of ordinary people who refused to leave, those who settled on the banks of a treacherous river and called it home, clinging to that place from generation to generation until the world around them changed. If you could have stood at the northern entrance of Old London Bridge one morning in 1632, as church bells rang, carriages had already set off, and shopkeepers were raising the shutters of their shops along the Thames, what would you have felt? I'd love to keep building this journey into the past with you. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Together, we're bringing history back to life. See you in the next era.